All right. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this webinar session for elected officials about Maryland's climate pathways. A couple of organizations you'll be hearing from today here at MDE, the Maryland Department of the Environment, UMD's Center for Global Sustainability, and also EPA. This session is one of many we've been hosting throughout the state to talk about the Maryland Climate Pathway Report. We've had sessions in Bowie, Hagerstown, Salisbury. We've got sessions coming up here in Baltimore and in Prince Frederick. We've been making the rounds all around the state and the internet here. Glad that you all can join us here today, especially the elected officials making time for this. Thanks to those of you who have attended some of the in-person sessions. That's been very helpful, and I think we hear it's been helpful from the attendees to hear directly from your constituents. And I hope that some of you can make it to some of our future sessions as well. Again, we got sessions coming up in Baltimore at Morgan State and in Prince Frederick at the College of Southern Maryland campus. Today we're going to be talking about Maryland's climate pathway. This is a report we issued along with the University of Maryland back in June as a step toward our plan to achieve Maryland's nation-leading greenhouse gas reduction goals. So a couple of introductions from MDE. I'm Chris Hoagland. I'm the Director of the Air and Radiation Administration. We're the part of the Department of the Environment that regulates air pollution, including the greenhouse gases that cause climate change. And we're the part of the state tasked with writing the state's plan to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals. We're joined by our partners at UMD Center for Global Sustainability. Dr. Kathleen Kennedy will be representing the university today, assistant research professor and one of the principal authors of the report. And then we're also pleased to be joined by EPA, Allison Riley, environmental protection specialist, will tell us about some of the federal funding going towards climate change mitigation efforts, including through the Inflation Reduction Act. So next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the agenda. So I'll give some background on what we're talking about and why. University of Maryland will brief out on the climate pathway. EPA will talk about federal funding. And then at the end of the presentations, which I promise won't be too long, we will open up for questions and comments from all the elected officials who have joined us. So when the time comes, we'll just use the raise hand feature here on Google Meet, and then we'll open the floor to you. And we're looking forward to hearing from you. So yes, thank you. So why are we talking about this? Climate change is already affecting us and will affect us more into the future. The map here on the left shows historic temperature change in the last century. This is from EPA. You can see that Maryland is generally warming faster than the rest of the country. That's especially apparent right now, as here it is September, and we're looking at 100-degree weather. This summer has been a challenging one all around the world. Here in the US, we've had persistent extreme heat in the South, parts of the Midwest. We're experiencing it now. Everyone recalls the unusually hot and dry spring up in Canada led to absolutely unprecedented wildfires across Canada, and several days when we were in the smoke plume from that, and we measured the worst air quality we've ever measured here in Maryland. So climate change through heat is already affecting us profoundly. The map on the right shows anticipated future precipitation patterns, the middle of this century compared to the prior century. And Maryland is expected to be one of the parts of the country where we'll see increased precipitation. Unfortunately, much of that will come in the form of increased intensity of storm events, so more extreme storms. Next slide, but there's a lot of other there are a lot of other impacts of climate change that we're looking at here in Maryland. Some examples are, higher water temperatures affecting fish, longer warm seasons increasing the spread of tick-borne diseases and mosquito-borne diseases. These extreme heat events, in addition to affecting our health, also increase our energy use and energy bills. Heat waves and droughts affect crop yields. We have sea level rise already affecting coastal areas in Maryland. So it's a profound threat and one that we need to address rapidly. And here in Maryland, we are doing that. Maryland is a climate leader, thanks to many of the elected officials on the line here today. Maryland was an early adopter of state climate change law, dating back to the first Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act in 2009. So we've been deliberately planning to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and putting policies in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for a long time. And it's paying off. Maryland is right at the top of the pack of states in terms of the pace at which we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. We're reducing even faster than California. So we have a lot of momentum on our side. Another thing that Maryland has on its side is world-class science. So the state partnered with the University of Maryland, the Center for Global Sustainability, to chart our pathway toward our greenhouse gas reduction goals established by the Climate Solutions Now Act, which are to reduce our statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2031 and to achieve net zero across the state by 2045. These are the most ambitious goals in state law of any state. We're proud of that in Maryland, that we have science-based greenhouse gas reduction targets, but it's going to take a lot of effort to get there. We have a lot of challenges to overcome. So we have some of the best scientists in the world working on this topic here in Maryland, and we brought them shoulder to shoulder with the bureaucrats here and the state agencies to chart our path forward. So Kathleen, are you on the line? I'll hand it off to Kathleen from the University of Maryland.
Thanks, Chris. So the goal of the Maryland's Climate Pathway Report is to chart a pathway to meet those goals that Chris was just describing. So to do this, we model two different scenarios. First is current policies, and this models all relevant policies at the state level in Maryland, but also includes relevant federal policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act. And so this scenario allows us to see how close we are with current policies to reaching these goals. And our model shows that these current policies would achieve around 51% reductions by 2031, which is on the right track, but still there's a gap to be met to reach that 60% goal. The second scenario is the Maryland's Climate Pathway scenario, which provides an inclusive and comprehensive approach to close that gap and reach the 60% goal, as well as charting a path to the net zero goal in 2045. And this pathway is really an all of society approach. So that means we're looking for emissions reductions across all sectors of the economy and thinking about how all levels of government, from state, local, and federal, as well as nonprofits, NGOs, faith-based groups, all these other groups can work together to achieve these emissions reductions. And with that kind of all of society approach, we can also realize substantial benefits for Marylanders through this pathway. So starting with a bit of context, you see here the overall emissions trajectory for the state starting in 2006 on the left. This is the baseline year for the state. So all of the percent reductions that I'll talk about throughout are measured from 2006 levels. And as you go forward, you can see the state has been reducing emissions already thanks to previous policy efforts like the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act and others. But the Climate Solutions Now Act did up the ambition. So that's where the 2031 goal comes in, which you see on this chart, as well as the 2045 net zero goal. This report focuses primarily on 2031, so that's what I'll be talking about the most, but I will mention a couple things relevant to the 2045 goal as we go through as well. So this chart is really a summary of the pathway to 2031 laid out in the report. So next slide, Mark. We begin here on the left. So this is the 2006 baseline that I mentioned, total greenhouse gas emissions reduction in Maryland in 2006. And the goal of the report is to show how to get from that left to the right side, which 2031 is on the right with the 60% reduction level in emissions. So how to get there, the first thing is to notice what we've already achieved through historical reductions. So this green bar that's circled right now is everything that the state has reduced as of 2020 gas emissions. Next. And now each of these individual bars you see in the middle are different sectors of the economy. And so the light shading that you see on the top of those bars is the current policy scenario that I introduced earlier. So all of the on-the-books policies in Maryland and at the federal level. The darker shading on the bottom of the bars is the Maryland's climate pathway scenario. So those are the additional emissions reductions that we need to get from each of these sectors to achieve that 2031 goal. So in the next slides, I'm going to walk through each of those different sectors and talk about which policies go into closing that gap. So beginning with the electricity sector, we model an 89% reduction in emissions here. And you'll see that in the chart here. So the dotted line is the current policy scenario. And the shaded areas are, so the gap between the shading and the dotted line is the difference between those two scenarios and the difference caused by those additional policies that we layer on in Maryland's climate pathway. So those policies include 100% clean energy sources by 2035. It involves collaboration both across Maryland and with other neighboring states to ensure that any imported power that Maryland uses from other states is also clean. And it involves boosting renewable energy deployment and accessibility through taking advantage of things like, next. In the transportation sector, we model a 49% reduction. So this involves things like smart growth and zoning reform that can reduce the overall level of vehicle miles traveled. It also involves ensuring access to state clean fleets regulation, which impacts like heavy duty vehicles.
Kathleen, we may be losing your connection. Looks like you're back. We lost you at clean vehicles.
Okay, so we modeled the adoption of federal incentives to help promote EV adoption, but we also model California's clean fleets regulation being adopted in Maryland, which affects heavy duty vehicles. And we model 100% electric bus sales by 2025, as well as the electrification of non-road sources such as lawnmowers or commercial forklifts, things like this. Next. In the building sector, we model a 35% reduction in emissions. This comes from a zero emissions appliance standard, which can act to both improve indoor air quality and safety, as well as reducing those emissions. We also model a zero emissions construction standard for new buildings, and we extend the existing energy efficiency standards that the state already has in place. Next. In the industrial sector, we model a 79% reduction. This comes from implementing Buy Clean standards for manufactured products to promote adoption of those greener practices. We also model a switch in fuel use in the cement industry away from coal to other cleaner sources of fuels. And we include the manufacturing sector in other decarbonization efforts. So currently, the manufacturing sector is exempted from greenhouse gas emissions regulations. But in this pathway, we do include the industrial sector fully in the emissions reduction efforts. Next. So next we have industrial processes and product use. This is different from the previous slide because in the previous one, it was only about fuel combustion. This sector doesn't look at fuel use in the industry. It looks at other processes, so like chemical reactions or product use that might release non-CO2 gases that are also warming in the atmosphere. So here we model things like lower process-related emissions in the cement manufacturing industry. We also use carbon capture and storage to reduce cement emissions beyond 2035. So that's one of the policies that I mentioned that isn't really relevant to 2031 because this is still a developing technology, but could have a big impact as we move forward toward that 2045 net zero goal. We also model a reduction in non-CO2 emissions from things like air conditioning and refrigeration. And this is important because those non-CO2s can be particularly difficult to mitigate sometimes. So really paying attention to those can be a big help in sectors like this. Next. In the fossil fuel sector, we model a 26% reduction in emissions. That comes from reducing natural gas use across all the sectors that we're talking about here today, as well as widespread monitoring of natural gas infrastructure, and ensuring that these policies lead to affordability and no increased costs for Marylanders, particularly vulnerable communities. Next. In the waste management sector, we model a 40% reduction. This comes from increasing recycling and waste diversion away from landfills. An important component of that is improving access to composting as one mitigation strategy. Next. In the agriculture sector, we model a 9% reduction. This is a bit smaller than some of the other sectors, but agriculture is a lower emitter overall than most of these sectors. And Maryland farmers have already been implementing good climate practices for a long time now. So continuing that does lead to this additional reduction, as well as pursuing some zero-cost mitigation opportunities in the livestock sector. Next. So the last sector here is a bit different than the others I've talked about. This is forestry and land use. And you'll notice that in the chart here, all of the numbers are negative. So the forestry and land use sector is actually a sink for emissions, meaning it's taking more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than it releases. So the 2031 goal in the state is only for gross emissions. So these negative emissions don't really count toward that goal. But for the net zero goal in 2045, we want to reach a balance of positive emissions and negative emissions that cancel each other out. So this sector is essential for that 2045 goal, and we want to protect and expand these natural sinks to help us reach that net zero target. And future analysis will expand on opportunities in this sector. Here, we're mostly assuming that trends stay constant going forward. So the final policy I want to mention applies across all these sectors, not just one, and that's a cap and invest program. So this is setting a cap on emissions and then using the proceeds from this program to reinvest in Maryland and support Marylanders. And this cap delivers 4% emission reductions overall toward that 60%. Next. So I mentioned at the beginning that this pathway can deliver significant benefits for Marylanders. And this is just a brief snapshot of some of those benefits. So starting on the left, when we're thinking about climate, by achieving that 60% emission reduction goal, we can contribute also to national and global reduction goals. But also this leads to co-pollutant reductions that can bring health benefits to Marylanders. So the middle column here is looking at some of those health benefits, specifically in the year 2031. And we would expect to see from these policies up to 1,000 fewer cases of upper and lower respiratory symptoms, up to 51 lives saved, and over 16,500 fewer days of restricted activity from pollution. There are also economic benefits to this plan. So cumulative through 2031, in that right column, you'll see those health benefits total up to between $1 and about $2.4 billion. There's also expected to be about 16,700 new jobs created and a $1.5 billion increase in personal income. Next. So now I'm going to switch lenses a little bit because the report doesn't just look at what emissions need to be reduced, but also thinks a little bit about how we can reduce those emissions and what are some of the important considerations there. So next. I'm going to walk through each sector again and just talk about some of those unique considerations and opportunities that are provided in each sector. So beginning with the electricity sector, it's important to note that decarbonizing electricity also enables decarbonization of many of the other sectors where electrification is an important strategy. So think about like transportation or buildings. Electrification is really key there, and decarbonizing electricity enables those sectors as well. It's important to make sure that this is an equitable transition and that access to incentives in the electricity sector are equitable across the state. In the transportation sector, we want to think about how to overcome barriers to the electric vehicle transition and reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. One really important consideration here is affordability, making sure that everyone has access to an electric vehicle who needs it. Also thinking about access to charging infrastructure, particularly for those who might not own their own home and can't install their own charging equipment. And also thinking about access to public transit, which can go toward reducing those vehicle miles traveled overall. In the building sector, we want efficient and clean building technologies to be available to everyone. So again, affordability is a key factor there. And also thinking about how we can provide access both to those who own their own home, but also those who rent. Next. In the industrial sector, decarbonization can be somewhat challenging, but it also has a lot of untapped potential. So really key here will be stakeholder engagement. There are already many industry leaders, including those in the cement industry, which I've mentioned a couple times through this presentation, who already have their own internal goals for reducing emissions and are moving forward, and the state can help support those efforts that are already underway. There's also room for research and innovation in industry for those areas where we might not have a perfect solution yet, and more innovation is needed to help develop those strategies. The waste management sector is an opportunity to achieve greenhouse gas reductions, but also has a lot of implications for equity, particularly thinking about the co-pollutants that come from landfills and incineration of waste and things like this. So these efforts can reduce pollution significantly while we use these waste diversion strategies to lower the overall amount of waste going toward landfills. And last, in the land and agriculture sector, these sectors can contribute to reductions while also supporting other state goals, such as the health of the Chesapeake Bay. So these policies can improve soil health, they can preserve and expand forest sinks, and they can also improve water and air quality. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. And so I'm sure you all have lots of thoughts on that. Please write them down, keep them in your head. We'll be turning to the comment portion shortly here. Thanks for raising your hands. We'll get to you. We do have a little bit more from EPA. We're grateful to be joined by EPA, Allison Riley from EPA Region 3, to talk a little bit about federal funding, and then we'll turn to those questions and comments. Hey, Allison, I see you on the screen. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Allison Riley. I work with the climate program at EPA Region 3. And today I'm going to be talking a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other funding programs that are supporting regional and national efforts to combat climate change. So as you may be aware, last summer, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And the goal was to reduce emissions of GHGs in the US by 40% over 2005 levels by 2030. So the Biden administration's goal is actually 50% by 2030. We're not going to get there entirely with IRA, but we're getting most of the way. And with some additional state and local and private sector actions, we think we have a good chance of reaching that 50% goal. And in doing so, we really want to help the country transition to a clean energy economy that's invested in a continued decarbonization over the long term. And let me be clear. So there's a huge array of tools in the Inflation Reduction Act that cover a wide swath of the federal government, as well as states and locals and other entities, not to mention tax credits and other incentive programs. But a huge chunk, $41.5 million is coming to EPA to be administered, with an additional $11.7 billion from a reinstated tax on oil and gas. And for comparison, the total agency budget for this year was just over $10 million. So this is a big influx of funding that's really unprecedented. And it's a historic moment for us as an agency and as a country. This is the biggest, broadest effort we've ever made towards addressing climate change. And I'm actually really excited to be a part of it. So next slide. All right, so that $41.5 billion is going to support about 24 new or existing programs, the biggest of which is the GHG Reduction Fund. That's $27 billion. $5 billion will go to planning and implementation grants for states and metro areas and local governments and tribes. There's also billions of dollars for environmental justice grants and grants to address GHGs from ports, methane reduction, electrification of vehicles, and much, much more. I feel like a game show host when you say that. There's a lot in the act. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these, some of these in a moment. So the idea here is we want to tackle the problem from as many directions as possible. So some of the funding pots are sector-based, so they tackle either mobile or stationary sources specifically. Others are looking to use a top-down approach, such as the planning grants. They're looking at the state level or the local level or the metro level for these comprehensive solution programs. And then we have programs that are directed at the communities themselves. So more of a bottom-up approach there. So in doing all this, we're hoping that we can really take a big bite out of that, out of our climate change problem by sort of coming at it from all sides. Next slide. So throughout the design of all these programs, we've made a concerted effort to keep certain principles in mind. We want to get maximum GHG and pollution reduction benefits. Was somebody saying something? Sorry. We want to improve public health as much as possible. We want to use this historic opportunity to address environmental justice. We want to make sure we're managing all this appropriately and effectively, of course. We want to be inclusive and transparent to ensure that our communities and stakeholders feel that they're part of the process as we go forward. And we want to build on our existing capabilities, our capacities and strengths as an agency. We want to do all this, of course, while ensuring financial integrity. Next slide. So today I'm just going to talk about a few of the many funding pots that are coming online under IRA. The first big program out of the gate, of course, as you probably heard about, is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. So the first phase of this is $250 million that it's in the process of being awarded to states. We're most of the way there. The awards are mostly done to states and metro areas and tribes for climate planning. There are 3 required deliverables under this program. So there's a priority climate action plan, there's a comprehensive climate action plan, and the status report that's due at the end of the 4-year period. The priority climate action plan is due March 1st of this year. That's a hard deadline. So we will see those publications of those plans on that day or before it. We're very excited, of course, to hear about all the different innovative measures that we expect to see under these plans that are going to be coming out, which will inform the next phase of the grant, which is the implementation phase. That's $4.6 billion for implementation of all of the measures that are going to be included under these plans. So we'll have a lot more information about. I can't talk a lot about that right now. We'll have a lot more information about it in a few weeks. We are expecting the NOFO for that to drop in the near future. That's kind of all I can say at this point in time. So next slide. So we also have $1 billion to cover to reimburse up to 100% of the cost of replacing heavy-duty vehicles with zero emissions models, as well as the associated electrification infrastructure, with a focus, of course, on non-attainment areas. There's a carve out for those areas because we want to get at the pollution problems that are sort of persistent in those areas. There's also an additional $60 million for the Diesel Emissions Reduction Fund Act grant program, which is a long-time program that we've been doing for many years, 15 years at least. And that's specifically to tackle the heavy-duty diesel legacy fleet. Next slide. Another program we're working on is $3 billion for, that's a funding stream to address emissions at ports. There's also a set aside there for non-attainment areas as well. This program is interesting because it can fund not just zero emissions technologies and infrastructure, but also planning activities. So we're sort of working out how that's going to work and what that opportunity is going to look like when it comes out right now. So I don't have a ton of information ready to go about that today, but you will hear a lot more about it in the next few months. Next slide. And finally, of course, there's the GHG Reduction Fund, which I mentioned earlier. That's $27 billion total through 3 mechanisms. One is the National Climate Investment Fund. Those funds will go to green banks for loan programs to finance GHG reduction projects. There's 2, the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. It's similar, but it focuses the funding on community-based lenders. And 3 is the Solar for All program, which you probably heard a bit about. That is launching, and that will fund up to 60 grants for local governments and nonprofits to invest in solar projects. Again, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of money that I've mentioned into this. There's also a lot more in sort of smaller, pots that is moving forward. I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the big ticket, components today. But there's a lot more under the grant under the program. I really urge you to look into the sort of details and all of the specifics of that, because there's really more that I could cover in the time that I have today. And I wanted to mention, I've dropped a number of links into the chat here. We are not the only government agency that has, funding opportunities available. There's, DOT, DOE. I put some of the guidebooks that have been made available by the White House. There's also the Energy Communities link that's at the bottom there. That is a sort of database, I think, that's searchable for bipartisan infrastructure law opportunities, as well as IRA information. So I urge you to sort of check out those links, take a look. I'm available all times to answer questions. You feel free to pick up at the phone and give us a call and ask us. And I wanted to mention my co-lead, Mark Rajowski, who I think is on the call, but he's been really helpful as we've been moving this program forward, because it's a lot of work and we're plugging along, but it's very exciting stuff. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. And so we're moving on to the comment portion of this. We heard from Allison. Thank you about the federal resources being brought to bear. It's very good that we have the federal government as a partner in this, and as a partner who's bringing really substantial funding to help enable this transition. And before that, we heard from Kathleen Kennedy at the University of Maryland about the university's pathway analysis, the analysis of how the state can achieve our goals. And so that was our sort of our interim step in the planning process. That report sort of laid out, how Maryland can change our energy use to achieve these goals, and the conceptual policies that would put the state on that pathway. And now we are doing outreach and listening as we develop, by December, the final plan with the specific steps we're going to take. So we're keenly interested in the input from the elected leaders on the line today about what strategies the state should pursue as we work toward that final plan and consider all of these options on the table. So I'm going to go through the hands raised in order. I see MDE staff has joined in to help facilitate this. Chris Beck, Deputy Program Manager for the Climate Program, please let me know if I'm moving off the queue here.
I think Senator Gallions first.
Excellent, thank you. And so I'd ask everyone, please introduce yourself, your position, who you represent, and then we'd love to hear your comment. Senator Gallion.
Good afternoon, Senator Jason Gallion, representing Harford and Cecil counties in the legislature. Thank you for having this for elected or for legislators, so we could ask these questions directly. I know once we get to session, there's going to be a lot of things going back and forth. So thank you for giving us this time. I have a few questions. Starting out, there's this new, I kind of almost like a new buzzword, all of society approach. I think that was something the Governor Inslee out in Washington State maybe coined that phrase. I don't know. I heard him mention that before in news releases. What exactly does that mean? All of society approach. Does that mean that currently only part of society is helping with these issues and we need to get everybody? What does that actually mean?
Sure. Well, Kathleen, feel free to jump in with your thoughts. But I think generally we'll need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from just about every part of our economy. And so we all need to participate, including all levels of government, right? So it's not purely a state government challenge. And we need to take a very broad view about where we can find reductions. I'll note that Maryland has been reducing across almost its entire economy. So we definitely have progress in many different areas to draw upon.
Okay. Next thing that was brought up in the presentation talked about, we're an importer of energy. So you'd like to bring in clean energy from other states. I'm just curious how that's going to happen. Is there huge solar projects that are going to happen in Pennsylvania or somewhere else, and they're going to bring that power to us? How are we going to ensure that the imported energy coming in is clean?
Thanks, Kathleen. I wonder if you could explain how the math in the model works and what was reflected in the changes in imported power greenhouse gases.
Sure. So basically, in Maryland's inventory, it uses the PJM grid as its sort of average for the imported emissions. And so we took that same approach in our model. So we're using an average of the PJM grid's emissions to account for what that imported power looks like. So part of our modeling is imagining that the RGGI group, which is a lot of those PJM states, will set more ambitious goals to reach clean power across the region. And there's also new available tools through PJM that they do have these renewable energy credits where they can time match the production of clean power with the use of that power somewhere else. So utilizing those kind of structures can help ensure that the imports are in fact clean power.
Okay, thank you. One thing you mentioned, being a full-time farmer in our citizen legislature, I'm always extra interested in the ag issues. You mentioned, and I appreciate that, the hard work agriculture sector is already done, and they're doing a great job. And then you talked about, I believe, zero cost opportunities in livestock. I think the one report was talking about the methane. So, I mean, where are we going with that? Are we going to have some, is there going to be pressure brought on to reduce cattle numbers it's a cattle flatulence issue. So how we tackle that? Where are we going with that? Are farmers going to be told, hey, you have to reduce your herd numbers because we need to meet these goals?
I can speak to what's in the report, and then Chris, if you want to add anything on the MDE side, but there's no reduction of numbers in the report. The report is just using the EPA's marginal abatement cost curves. So it's looking at different strategies that can reduce emissions and then assigning a cost of how much would it take to really implement these things. And so we just implemented any of the strategies that would not cost Maryland farmers any additional money. They're zero cost or cost saving. And so that could be things like feed additives or other strategies like that, where you're not changing the herd, but you're just managing them a little bit differently.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple more points, Mr. Chair, if I may, or a couple more questions. I don't want to take up too much time. I know there's others waiting. There's a lot of talk about the potential health benefits. My question on that is, we have these very ambitious goals in Maryland, but these health issues aren't going to stop at the state line. I mean, if they're not doing the same thing in surrounding states, I mean, a little state like Maryland, it's not like when we hit the Mason-Dixon line that the folks in the northern part of the state aren't going to be feeling those effects. So I'd just like to hear a little more how this can be a regional effort and how it's not just Maryland out on a limb, but really maybe a nationwide or regional group working together.
I think I absolutely, yeah, that's a point well taken. And we always do try to pursue these strategies regionally where we can. For example, there was mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is a power plant program that we implement with now 11 other states. And of course, there needs to be a federal solution. So it's extremely useful that the federal government has put in place new policies. I'll note that the health benefits in the report are tied to the emissions that that the university is estimating in Maryland. So there are substantial benefits just from reducing our own pollution on top of the benefits from our neighbors coming along as well. And we need to pursue both of those strategies wherever we can, I think, is the outcome of the takeaway from the report.
Okay, and to follow up, just one final question for now. We have, a lot of our constituents are hurting financially and are struggling, paycheck to paycheck. And if I worry about increases in bills and rates and such, so we're trying to, really push towards electrification, EVs and whatnot. We had a bill, I believe, last session that pushes towards having, in construction where it's ready to plug in EVs, which, makes sense. We're heading that way. I believe I even voted for that bill. My concern is, as we look at the potential cost savings that we're told we're going to get if you switch to electric vehicles, that's moving away from gas or fossil fuels. Has there been any thought or studies put in on the amount folks' electric bills will increase once they're plugging in an electric car every night and driving? Has that been looked at? I just wonder really what the cost savings are. What has that been studied to see if your electric bill goes up $200 or $300 a month once you have an electric vehicle? Does that I mean, is that really as cost effective as just having a efficient gas motor?
I appreciate that. Maybe Kathleen, you could explain how the model works and how that cost is accounted for, right? The sort of the shift in spending from gasoline to electricity. I'll note that right now the rough estimates given Maryland's electricity rates and gas prices, which change over time, is that mile per mile driving an electric vehicle in Maryland costs you about 1/4 as much in fuel as gassing up on electric. But Kathleen, how does the model account for the fact that electric vehicles have a cost too?
Right. So this is one of the strengths of the model that we use, really, that it has these kind of intersectoral dynamics. So if you have more EVs, you're using more electricity. And so the model responds and it changes things in the electricity sector to produce that electricity that's needed. So all of that is built into the pathway, all of those different impacts. It does also have those impacts on the cost side. However, the model is done kind of in aggregate, so we don't have individual costs for specific people, in different levels of the income strata. However, the economic analysis done by our partners at the Regional Institute for Economic Analysis, RESI, they do have that kind of analysis where they'll look at the difference in these costs and all of the different sectoral impacts, and they still found an overall aggregate benefit for the state with all of those things included. So those were the numbers that I was sharing with the economic benefits. That's with all of those prices included.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Senator, for your questions and comments. And I'll note RESI, the Regional Economic Studies Institute, that's part of Towson University, another partner in this project. So Chris Beck, who's next on our list?
Delegate Boyce.
Delegate Boyce, good to see you.
Oh, I didn't think I was next. I'm in a loud place, so I'll be very quickly, and I'm going to start backwards. I wanted to know whether or not I'm a delegate with Gina T. Boyce. I'm vice chair of the House Environment and Transportation Committee. I wanted to know if MDE has applied for any of the climate reduction grants for EPA, and if so, which ones? Would be interested in knowing. I'll start off there.
Sure thing. So there were the climate pollution reduction planning grants that Allison mentioned. Those are grants to the department, and the department has applied to that. Maryland was, in fact, the first state out of all 50 to get our letter in to reserve our spot for that. So we have received the planning grant, and then once we complete the plan assuming we meet Allison's deadlines, which we will, then we become eligible to apply for implementation grants to do the sort of project work called for in the plan. And those are the larger ones, the larger grants than the planning grant.
Thanks so much, Chris. My next question was about the forest and land use negative emissions portion of the study, and whether or not forest conservation and our tree planting legislation in the past contributes to that model.
So this is something I mentioned briefly, that future analysis is going to expand on what we did in the Pathways report. Because those negative emissions are not included in the 2031 goal, it's only gross emissions for 2031. The negative emissions aren't really as important for that calculation. They're more for the 2045 net zero goal. And so for the Pathways report, we basically just held constant the current trend, so staying at the 2020 levels. Going forward, we are hoping to include more analysis and show some of those impacts from other policies.
Thank you so much. And then my next question was about, I think to Senator Gallian's point about costs and fees, especially as we talk about a gas tax and moving away from fossil fuels, we'll now have more electric vehicles, transportation vehicles, and where in the analysis is there a look at what that potentially is there a discussion about moving to essentially an EV tax per se, if we're going to then be losing those dollars for our user funds?
Well, I'll start with that one. And that is a key important issue that's a little bit out of the scope of this particular analysis, but it's a hugely important issue. And I know that there's the commission set up to look at that long term, has launched, and they're chewing on that. We do not analyze it directly in this report.
Thank you. And I think my last question, I just want to make sure I cover all my, waste diversion. I'm sorry, I missed one of my questions. Waste, is there any part of the modeling that looks at waste reduction as it relates to a reduction of certain product use? Beyond, we talked about plastic bags, we've talked about styrofoams. Is there anything else that the model may be looking at as it relates to a reduction of what we use as it relates to a reduction of waste?
Yeah, that's not part of the model itself. So we didn't model reduction of product use. We modeled diversion away from landfills for that sector. But that is, of course, another policy that could be considered.
Yes, we're absolutely interested in input on how to address that in the climate plan.
I think I'm done. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Delegate Boyce. Delegate Ruth, you're next.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for being off camera. Delegate Sheila Ruth, I represent District 44B in Western Baltimore County. I'm on the Environment and Transportation Committee. So first of all, I did just want to follow up on Delegate Boyce's last question that I think that reduce portion for waste is really important, that diversion only gets us part of the way, that we need to be reducing in the first place the amount of waste that we're generating and using. The second question I had, the report talks about how transportation electrification only gets us part of the way, and that we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled as well. It talks about land use policies to do that, but I didn't see any mention of telework, and I was wondering if telework was modeled at all in this, the impact of telework on reducing vehicle miles traveled. And also more specifically, I'm concerned about reports that we're hearing that the federal government is starting to return people back to the office who have been teleworking, and given the number of federal employees in Maryland, if that's something that's under discussion, the impact of that.
Sure, thanks. So the VMT in the model, it draws from travel demand modeling performed by MDOT and the Metropolitan Planning Organizations. And so I believe some telework practices do factor into those projections. But I hear your comment that we should talk more explicitly about telework in the December plan and its impacts one direction or the other. And so I think that's a useful comment.
Thank you. And as specifically as relates to the federal government, I don't know if the EPA folks have any input on that. Is that something that the federal government is considering when they're trying to move people back to the office?
I can't really comment. That's not something I'm really looped in on here. I'm at home now, so we are still doing telework as of right now. Whether that will change, I don't know. I don't think that's a decision that's likely to be made at the agency level. I think that is a government-wide decision. At least that's what it sounds like to me, but I don't really know. Sorry.
All right. Thank you so much. I have a few other comments. I'll send them separately. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Delegate Ruth. Senator McKay.
Thank you very much. Senator McKay, representing District 1, that's Garrett, Allegheny, and Washington County, but more especially representing Appalachia, Maryland. And Appalachia, Maryland has been left behind in so many different areas economically. And a lot of this a lot of my questions have to deal with some of the economic, I'm trying to be as positive as I can, but the struggles that we have out here with jobs and pay and stuff like that. I was reading somewhere that electric heat pumps that were mandated in the UK, many of the homeowners are now complaining that they can't get their homes warm enough for winter. And as you all well know, we deal with extreme winter out in Western Maryland. Has the discomfort or any potential health problems on unreliable heat pumps been considered at all? And is there another avenue? I know that in my office in Cumberland, our heat pump on a regular basis cannot keep my staff warm, and we have to go to emergency heat. And when we go to emergency heat, the price of electric just goes through the roof. And while we can afford it in this district office, my people can't. And so has there been any consideration about heat pumps and the potential health problems that may arise for those who are dealing with heat pumps that aren't just getting there warm enough for winter?
Sure. Thanks for the comment and an additional avenue to explore. I do know that we have considered that while most of Maryland is in the sort of the middle temperate climate zone, Western Maryland is in fact in the next colder zone. So there is a material difference in climate in different parts of the state, and that's an important thing to consider. Certainly, we do know that heat pump technology is improving. And the newer heat pumps perform much better at lower temperatures than the older ones, but it's absolutely a challenge that we need to consider in development of these policies, I believe. And of course, we're all ears about how to design policies to navigate that particular challenge.
Well, I appreciate that. Governor Moore put an exclamation point, making sure that nobody would be left behind. And while we come up for these the climate pathway, we need to make sure that all of Maryland is taken care of and not redlined or forgotten again like Appalachia has in the past. One of the things we have up here is propane. Matter of fact, I was doing some mulching around a house that was a propane house. It's right outside Hagerstown. And matter of fact, as I looked at the community that I was in, a lot of people, it was propane that everybody was using. And, propane has lowered the CO2 and air pollution impacts than gasoline and diesels in buses and now widely used. Has the switch from propane from buses been considered in this transitional climate pathway step? Or will we be able to continue to use propane? It's very, very hard for infrastructure up here as well. I can think about the Georges Creek area and being able to get internet. That's also a hard part. Now, I know that's not what we're talking about, but that's the infrastructure that we're talking about. And the people who live along that really can't afford to put it in themselves, the infrastructure. So if these people are dealing with propane, is there something within the climate pathway that will address that to help them transition?
I think certainly, yeah, providing adequate funding for every part of the state to benefit from this, especially low and moderate income households, is I think absolutely a core consideration in the development of the plan, as well as the policies under the plan. And so, yeah, we'd love to hear input about how to achieve that objective.
Okay. Well, I've got some other questions. I'll ask them offline, but thank you for the presentation. There again, I just think we need to really remember what the governor said, that no one would be left behind. And there's no doubt about it. There's a lot of benefits living in the I-95 corridor that not all of Maryland gets to benefit from that. And I'm very appreciative of all the help along I-95. But when we're talking about miles driven with EVs, got a gentleman that has an EV in Garrett County, and the performance drops half. Matter of fact, he keeps his gasoline truck around so that he can use that in the wintertime. And so while I know we're making strides, the reality is that there is a different climate in Western Maryland, and I appreciate you, Chris, acknowledging that. So with that, I'll be quiet because I think there's some other questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKay. Senator Reedy.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks everybody that presented, and I hope we'll get an email with that presentation. That would be really great to be able to go through it further. And one question that comes to mind, I've always kind of kept an eye on the whole vehicle miles traveled issue over the years. What percentage of the emission savings that are in this plan are based on fuel bans for vehicles and buildings? It sounds like we're trying to get away from any sort of natural gas or gas burn. So what's the percentage of the emission savings? Is that at your fingertips for anybody?
So in the December plan, we'll be providing, and we're required to provide additional information at individual policy level. So we'll be looking more at that. But electrification of end uses in transportation and buildings is a core part of our greenhouse gas reduction strategy, as moving away from fossil fuel combustion and toward other forms of energy is sort of a necessary step to reduce GHGs to achieve the goals that we have.
If there's a federal lawsuit, because there's going to be lawsuits, I think there already are some, about the constitutionality of fuel bans. I mean, if that were to be something that was struck down, where do we go from there if you can't ban a certain type of fuel or restrict a certain type of fuel?
Well, this report has conceptual pathways. I don't know that so many of those, or conceptual policies, I don't know that so many of those policies would be a fuel ban rather than other policies that transition toward cleaner options. But that's an important legal consideration, certainly, and we'd love to hear more about how to navigate that.
What's the have we calculated because we spent a lot of time last session talking about electrification, and has the kind of the cost and impact of switching from, is it like the total energy use from switching to all electric heating and hot water, has that been calculated as part of this plan? Do we know what that total energy change would be and the total cost would be? Because I saw the economic benefits that were listed, but they didn't happen to notice. Were those net economic benefits, or were those just what we get from doing the switch?
Yeah, I wonder, Kathleen, could you explain how the changes in energy use patterns are reflected in the analysis?
Right. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that the model has these kind of intersectoral dynamics. So we do track, there is a decrease in energy use in some sectors, increase in others, depending on where that demand ends up. And so we do track that, and we track how that energy use breaks out, how much is electricity versus other sources. So that's all in the Pathways report. As for the economic benefits, yes, that's a net number. Like I said, what I showed in the slides was a cumulative through 2031 number.
If and I can try to conclude here with this, but if we look at the overall issue with the cap and trade or cap and invest slide, it's all of that only accounts for a 4% emissions reduction.
Right, so that's the last policy that we layer on top. So all of the other policies that I mentioned in the preceding slides were modeled first, and then the cap was added just to close the remaining gap. So the other policies make up the bigger chunk there.
I just have noticed, I've been trying to study up on this, knowing that this is something that's coming down. Pennsylvania had some pretty dramatic emissions reductions, and they did it without a cap and trade. Our emissions goals we met really from 2006 till 2020 largely were not because of any renewable energies we did. It was mostly because we switched to natural gas as a state overall from coal for a number of reasons, environmental and cost. But I think, we've had subsidized, energy generation, renewable energy generation for a long time, and it does not produce a lot. So I'd be concerned that cap and trade could end up, or cap and invest could end up costing, particularly lower income Marylanders, a lot more than it would be worth in the emissions reductions that we get. But that's something I'm sure we can get into as policymakers, a policy debate. I appreciate the answers. I had a lot of interest in the propane issue too, but we got a lot of people on the call, so maybe that's something we can dive into offline a little bit more. A lot of us rural folks that represent rural areas, a lot of people use propane, and it's a pretty clean source of energy. So anyway, I'll leave it with that. Thank you for answering my question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Delegate Stein.
Thank you. Delegate Dana Stein, representing District 11B in Northwest Baltimore County. First, I just want to thank the University of Maryland and MDE for putting together a very comprehensive climate pathway. I have two questions. The first one follows up on the previous questions about vehicle miles reduction. There was a reference to in the plan to smart growth and zoning reform as propelling, reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And I was wondering if there was any specific policy that you had in mind behind that.
So I can speak just to the modeling piece. We don't model any.
Customers having the option to choose whether they'd like an internal or external installation.
We don't model any specific policies within that. It's just an aggregate reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And then we mention the policies that are known to support that goal. So the specifics on that, you'll have to talk to the MDE and MDOT folks, I think.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. And my second question is, someone talked about all the benefits to households and businesses in the Inflation Reduction Act, with respect to energy efficiency, electrification, EVs, renewables. And I guess my question is, what will the state be doing to get the word out to homeowners, to businesses about these opportunities? So right now, I think there's very little knowledge or understanding of all of these benefits, which, the plan counts on in helping, drive to our emission reduction goal. So is there some sort of plan in place, or will that be left to local jurisdictions?
I think it's a good point and a good comment, as consumer adoption is crucial to achieving the goals.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Delegate. Delegate Foley?
Thank you very much. I'm Delegate Linda Foley, and I represent District 15, which is the western part of Montgomery County, including the agricultural reserve in Montgomery County. And so I have a couple of questions. First, let me just echo my colleagues' congratulatory and appreciative comments about the Pathways report. I found it very, very helpful, not just to see where we are, but also giving me as a legislator some ideas of where we can go to reach these goals that we set out. I should mention I'm also on the Environment and Transportation Committee. I did want to sort of follow up on something Senator Reedy asked about. He asked about getting this presentation sent to us. It might be helpful too if you put in the chat the link to the actual report itself, just for purposes of this conversation, in case some people haven't seen it, because I do think it's an excellent report. Now to my questions. My first question is about waste management, which in the report and in this presentation, you spent a lot of time on. Delegates Boyce and Ruth both expressed some desire to have something about reduction on the front end, reduction of waste on the front end. I think that's important. But beyond that, I mean, particularly when it comes to incineration, I did find the report a little bit lacking in terms of recommendations about what do we do to replace that, not just in terms of getting rid of waste, but also the electricity production that it generates. I mean, I think we have to look at it two areas. So will there be more on that in the December report, or are you just kind of leaving that where it is?
Well, I think we're all ears on considerations or potential policies that you'd like us to consider in the report, specifically dealing with the two waste incinerators and those two sides you mentioned, the energy production and the emissions.
Okay, so you're kind of looking to us to help with that. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, we're sort of in listening mode on every single topic. We have some conceptual policies. There wasn't one specifically dealing with the incinerators in the report. And so, yeah, we hope to have as complete a package as possible in December to address everything. And yeah, we're looking for.
Okay, thanks. And then a similar question on a different topic, and that's with respect to the reduction in emissions of non-road polluters, I'll put it that way, or fossil fuel users, specifically lawn care. This is an area I personally am interested in as a legislator because I represent a largely suburban district and they're really sick of gasoline-powered leaf blowers and the noise, for example. But I am interested in looking at reducing and moving to electrification in that area. And I just wondered if the department either is going to come out with some guidelines on that, because it kind of left it blank in the report, or if, again, you're all ears and wanting to get some input and possibly some legislation from us.
Yeah, I think both. We know it's a concern. I remember there was legislation on the topic earlier, this year's session. Kathleen, was there anything in the model about changes in some of those non-road sectors like landscaping equipment?
Right, so that's not something that's modeled directly in GCAM, which is the model we use. But we did include some effects of electrification more based on industry projections. So what the industry analysts are saying might happen in lawn care equipment going forward and what's the potential there. And we just kind of followed those trends.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the report.
Thank you, Delegate Foley. Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you. Delegate Lori Charkoudian, I represent District 20. I serve on Economic Matters and Public Utilities Subcommittee and do a lot of energy work. Thank you so much for all of your work on this, to all the people who have been working on it and to all the people on this call who are giving feedback. And I appreciate the tour of the state and getting feedback. I just want to make sure I understand if I'm following, because there's been some questions about what specifically are you going to do? Obviously, what we're looking at right now is not very specific. If I understand correctly, where we are right now is that you're saying, here's the broad areas we expect to have to address, and we expect to break it down this way, and that what we'll see in December will be the specifics, whether there'll be regulatory changes you plan to make or legislative proposals that you'll be bringing to us. Is that right?
That's right. Informed by what we're hearing in this outreach.
So these are our opportunities to sort of direct what it is that we're likely to see with feedback, in addition to the additional work that you all are continuing to do and getting feedback across. Okay, thank you. So I think that the suggestions that I want to make, or the concerns I want to raise, I think the most significant one is the first 51%. So as I understand what you've done here is you've said, we've done really good policy work, and thank you. I think we have. We can all congratulate ourselves for that, as well as the federal government. We've done great policy work, and it gets us to 51%, and here's the final 9%. And I think the 9% that you're looking at, while I have feedback on that, my bigger concern is the first 51%. And specifically, if I understand the modeling that happened, the modeling assumed that we actually implemented effectively every single piece of that 51%. And so just off the top of my head, what I know to be in that 51% and the concerns that I have, I know, for example, that we're behind on our solar carve out in the state of Maryland. We're behind on rooftop. We're behind on utility. All of the work that the IRA theoretically will allow us to meet in terms of carbon decarbonization, both in-state and out-of-state PJM grid, depends on a functional PJM interconnection queue, and it depends on transmission upgrades to be able to take that in. There's nothing to suggest that PJM interconnection queue is going to be functional anytime soon, and there's nothing to suggest that we're going to get the transmission upgrades that are needed. And so my concerns are, and my request is, that in addition to focusing on this 9%, that's just a tiny piece. I feel like I could go on with all of the things that I think could go wrong with the 51%. And so I'm just wondering if, and my suggestion is that part of what MDE do in your report of both what are the policy program legislative changes that are needed, that include reviewing that 51% to talk about what are the policy changes needed, what are the implementation changes needed, what do we need to change in the state or in our advocacy with our federal partners in order to maximize the likelihood that we hit that 51%. And I'd also be interested in seeing and talking with you about if we don't hit that 51%, can we be, I mean, I think we need to be padding our proposals with more, because I don't think we're going to hit that 51%. So in my mind, we should be looking at like what would hit 63%, because I think we can assume that some of that, I don't know if 63 is the right number, your modeling could probably tell us, but I think that there's a real concern about that 51%. And I think we need to kind of get at it in a couple of different ways. So I'll stop there for you to comment on that. And then I do have one or two other comments that I wanted to make. So let me hear your thoughts on that first.
I think, yeah, appreciate it. Hear the comment. We've identified some of the similar barriers, like the pace of solar deployment related to achieving current policies, and it's a very important issue. And so we'll sort of, and we're considering how to address that in the final plan, right? Where it's supposed to be sort of a plan that says, all right, if the plan works, here's what'll happen. But then how do we talk about what happens when things don't work? And so we understand that there's a lot of desire to talk about both sides of that. Given what we know about existing challenges like the pace of solar builds. So appreciate the comment.
Okay. And I would just suggest that we include in there the engagement with the regional transmission operator, engagement with our federal team that can engagement at FERC, all of those kinds of things, because I think we talk a lot about the pieces that we maybe have control within the state, streamlining, the state's portions of solar, for example, or adjusting incentives for solar. But there's pieces that are very much out of the state's control, but the state should be playing an active role, I think, in pushing on those levers as well. I think the second thing that I just wanted to ask about, you've made some references to sort of this, how do we get to the 2045? And I just want to know how, so while I think to the 2031 goals, we don't need to have completely electrified all of our buildings to meet 2031, but we do essentially have to have done full electrification for the 2045 goals. And I'm trying to understand how the policies, I worry about investing in policies, and I think, empower supporting gas appliances would be an example. Investing in any policy that might still be okay or might help us reach a 60% goal, but actually would be a barrier to reaching our 100% goal, and how conversations that are happening now sort of tee us up, not just for the 60%, even though that's the top priority because it's happening the soonest, but also tee us up for success to make sure we're not double spending on something that's okay, but not as good, but would be okay for the 60% goal, but would absolutely not be okay for us to reach the 100% goal. And I'm thinking about gas infrastructure, but I'm sure there's other, both in behind the meter and in front of the meter, but I'm sure there's other examples as well. So can you talk a little bit about how that is being considered in this conversation?
Sure. And so Kathleen, feel free to tell us how the modeling works when we're looking at both 2031 and 2045. Maybe I'll preface that with, the law requires us to put forward a 2031 plan that helps us get to 2045, not hurts it, right? And so we're trying to do analysis that considers both of those goals and accounts for those exact issues that you're mentioning, which is that if we're doing a whole bunch of things that help us with 2031 but hurt us with 2045, then that's maybe not the right approach. And that'll be reflected since we're looking at since we're developing a plan that gets us on the right line for both of those goals, then sort of that constraint, that objective is in our process to begin with.
Okay. I guess the last thing that I just want to sort of leave as a thought and a piece of feedback is that there is this false narrative out there that building in vehicle electrification is going to crash our electric grid. And I say it's a false narrative, not because there's nothing to the need for addressing the electric grid, but because the question isn't, can we do it? It's really, how do we do it? And there's a lot of technologies in place that flatten winter peaks and that address bidirectional charging and demand response and all these other things that allow us to electrify while also keeping a resilient grid in place and not requiring a huge investment. There'll be some investment on the grid. And I'm just wondering how that piece of the conversation, I know there's a PSC study that's happening. But I'm worried that there's those conversations about the grid and the buildings are sort of happening to some extent in parallel, but not in the same conversation. And really how the way that we electrify, and specifically, for example, the role of network, thermal networks, geothermal, as well as air source heat pumps, the questions about bidirectional charging, those kinds of things, how we do that really is going to answer the question of what the impact is going to be on the grid. And so I feel like those are really important pieces to be talking to each other. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that, and I'll stop at that question.
It's a good one. And so I think from the state agency perspective, the way we're trying to manage all these parallel processes is that this one is sort of very general, right? This is the economy as a whole moving in the direction it needs to go. There are lots and lots of specific challenges there, and then there's more specific processes, right? Like the grid study that you mentioned, looking at those specific issues. And so we try to sort of make each of these studies work for its particular scope. So this one, this plan, we aren't going to be able to solve the grid, the very specific grid stuff in our economy-wide plan because we're looking at things at a much higher level. However, we identify those challenges, we set the benchmarks for the sector as a whole, and so that, the considerations from our higher level study can be brought into those more specific studies, whether it's the grid study or any of the other number of studies, right? Our heavy duty vehicle study that we're required to do next year, for example. So we have to sort of make all these processes talk to each other through the network of groups and studies we've set up, and make sure each one sort of works at its particular scale, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Delegate Solomon.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the opportunity. Delegate Jared Solomon, represent the 18th District in Montgomery County, the communities of Kensington, Chevy Chase, Wheaton, Silver Spring. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Appreciate all of the incredible amount of work that went into this. Couple of comments. One, very, very minor one, and to all the other nerds out there watching, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. The links to the footnotes do not appear to work. It takes you to sort of a file storage site that you can't log into. So I don't know if there's a way, I don't know if maybe the report's still sort of in draft form or something, but for some of the links that I was really interested to look at, the citations don't take you anywhere. So it's just a minor thing. And then on the policy side, I did want to echo the comments of Delegate Stein, particularly on the transportation piece. That's an area that I've spent a lot of time working on. I think, I liked the mention a lot, obviously, of land use policies, but I think, so much of the land use policy obviously is driven by local governments. And there's not currently a whole lot that the state really does on that. So I think the more specific that you all can be, and just kind of curious if your intent is that the state plays maybe more of a bigger role in that or puts incentives in place. Be curious to hear your comments on that.
I think, so the state we have our sort of our transit-oriented our compact development targets, right? And so those are certainly reflected in the VMT projections, and smart growth and transit-oriented development are really key strategies. I think we want to respect the sort of the division of authority between state and local government, but how to navigate that input on what's most useful for local governments from this plan is definitely a good thing to hear, so that we can make it of greatest use to all the levels of government that are engaged in planning and land use and zoning and development issues.
Great, thank you, Chris. And then the other question I've got is, obviously, I think, to be candid, I think many of us disagreed with some of the priorities that were often in the previous administration's consolidated transportation plan. And we're much more excited to embark under this administration's policies. And so I guess I'm just sort of curious, how much do you see what's coming out of this plan and what ultimately will be published in December as sort of a hand in glove with what long-term investments and long-term projections that MDOT is going to choose to make? I mean, I think, obviously, if we're trying to incentivize, reduce vehicle miles traveled, is there going to be an additional level of analysis that goes into the CTP? I mean, I know there's conversations around that, and at the previous, the commission meeting, the commission that's starting to look at vehicle miles traveled, obviously broader issue on the tax, that came up a little bit at the first meeting, that the CTP process is kind of a little bit of a black box, within MDOT. So how much of this work, which obviously MDOT's planning is so critical to meeting these targets, particularly in transportation, how much of this is going to be intersecting and collaborative?
Yeah, that's a great point. I can't answer exactly for MDOT because I'm not MDOT, but I'll know that MDE and MDOT, we work very closely together on this specific plan, right? So MDE isn't writing the transportation section without MDOT, right? We make sure our numbers match their numbers as much as possible in different modeling environments. MDOT is engaged in their carbon reduction strategy right now, which is due in November. And so we're making sure that our priorities in this plan and MDOT's priorities in their planning processes match, and that we're speaking with one voice about what needs to be done. So that part is absolutely important and happening, and and so we're making sure we're being consistent.
Thanks. And then just the last point I'm going to make, and I know it was mentioned, particularly appreciated the fact that the last town hall was in Bowie, right next to a MARC station. But I have a little bit of a parochial interest because I've worked a lot on legislation on this, and I know it's a priority of this administration. But I think the more that you all can highlight specifically investments in the MARC rail system, we have incredibly good bones of a system that literally reaches almost every corner of the state, or there's plans potentially to expand it in every corner of the state, rural, urban, the western part of the state, the central part of the state. And we have a lot of plans in the works, but obviously we're going to need money for it. And just, I think the more that we can emphasize the changing nature and the role of the MARC rail system in the changing way that people commute, could really make a huge difference. And Chris, thanks again for organizing this. It's good to see you.
Great, thanks. Thanks,
Senator West.
Thanks. Good to be with you all. And first of all, let me add to what everybody else has said. It's great that both Chris's and Dr. Kennedy and Ms. Riley were with us today to provide all this information. The problem is the information is very general. Let me explain relate two experiences I've had recently. I was at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, and a woman stood up and said that they had just installed a $300,000 chiller in an office building, and she was fearful they're going to have to rip it out and throw it away, even if it was brand new. And then other constituents have come up to me concerned that they're going to have to rip out their gas stoves and throw them away. So my experience has been that where there's a lack of specificity and things are too vague, that translates into opposition. So my recommendation to you is that you try to be as specific as possible when you introduce this final report, and that you, for example, give hypothetical examples of households. This household has a hot water heater that's powered by gas. And this household, the husband drives 30 miles round trip each day in a gas car to his place of work, and the wife drops the kids off at school, and then she travels her own 15 miles back and forth to her place of work. And then how is this report going to actually affect that household? What's going to be the tangible impact on that household in terms of the state's policies between now and 2031? Again, to the extent that you can alleviate anxiety, you're going to find the report is better accepted. To the extent that people are concerned they're going to have to throw away $300,000 chillers or replace their gas stoves, it's going to engender hostility and fervent opposition. I've got a few more questions, but do you have a response to that?
I appreciate it. Yeah, I think that's very helpful guidance as we craft the December report.
Okay. You've done a lot of planning so far. Do you have any estimate of how much this is going to cost the average taxpayer in the state, and in terms of extra expenses between now and 2031?
So we're including more detailed funding analysis as part of the planning process. And so we're taking a more specific look at that as part of the next step. In the
Okay.
meantime, all of these sort of the economic costs and benefits are factored into the calculations about what it means for the economy and what it means for our overall energy expenditures, for example.
All right. Well, all this is important. I haven't heard the word nuclear mentioned at all. I have not read the report. Maybe nuclear is in the report. Carver Cliffs is reportedly nearing the end of its useful life. I don't know whether BG&E is planning on upgrading Carver Cliffs so that it will be usable for another generation. Does the report focus on nuclear energy at all, or are we putting all our eggs in the electrical basket?
So Kathleen, maybe you could explain more detail how nuclear energy factors into the model. I will note that the continued operation of Calvert Cliffs is in the model and is in the pathway.
Dr. Kennedy, do you want to add anything?
Yes. So Calvert Cliffs is already licensed to go past 2031, which is the big milestone that this report is aimed at. But we also model continued operation through 2050. So that would be another relicensing after that as part of the trajectory to reach 2045. So we do model continued nuclear generation.
Okay. And then my final question relates to zoning. One of the Paris-Glendening's administration focused on smart growth. And there was an awful lot of opposition to that from those who were concerned that it was going to turn the zoning decisions over to the state government and take them away from the counties. Is there anything in this report or your plans which would go down that road of impairing county autonomy in making zoning decisions and turn those decisions over to the state?
Well, this report is, again, sort of conceptual policies to get us on these energy use trajectories, and there's nothing in my read of the report that would do that specifically.
Okay. I guess, let me ask one more question. It comes to, I think it was it Delegate Charkoudian who indicated, or maybe it's Delegate Foley who indicated that that there is no problem with the grid coming up with all the electricity that's needed. I'm no expert on this, but it just would seem logical that if you're going to take all the cars on the road, which are currently powered by gas, and convert them into electrical cars, you're going to need a whole lot more electricity than currently is the case. I had the experience a couple of years ago trying to get rid of the state's coal-burning power plants. And so I had conversations with PJM about whether or not that would be possible. And PJM said, well, if we went down that road, they would have to take a hard look at it to see whether or not the grid could continue to function properly without those, at that point, 6 remaining coal-burning electrical power plants. Based on that experience, my conclusion is that if we convert all of the cars to electric, we're going to have a problem with the electricity. Does the plan come up with viable mechanisms to make sure that regionally there's enough electricity? I assume other states are proceeding on the same lines, that regionally there's going to be enough electricity to power all of the electrical appliances, cars, et cetera, that we're going to need to be powered in 2031.
Yeah, so we definitely, in terms of just the analysis, it accounts for the increased electricity demand from electric vehicles and from electrical appliances, and the model includes sort of basically modeling to ensure that the lights are still on, right? That there is enough electricity to go around. The good news with electric vehicles is that the demand is relatively flexible. First, it's not actually as much electricity as you would think. A couple decades from now, if we were to electrify all the vehicles, it would be a substantial amount, but it takes a long time to get there. So the trend is manageable. Also, EV charging electricity demand is flexible. We've seen this, for example, in California, which has much higher rates of electric vehicle use than we have here in Maryland, and they've been able to successfully shift that demand around to avoid the hours of the year on hot summer afternoons where electricity demand is at its peak. So if you're charging outside of the peak hours, electric vehicles can sort of complement the grid rather than stress the grid, and especially once EVs are coming out that are capable of balancing the grid through bidirectional charging. I think we heard about that earlier. then they could certainly, make the grid more resilient to deal with changes in demand and high demand hours, rather than making it less resilient. But I don't believe, Kathleen, that we explicitly model vehicle to grid in the report. We just account for the increased demand. Yeah, but that's an additional potential avenue to manage that demand in a way that could make the grid more resilient and also cost effective if we're using resources that are built only for a couple hours a year. If we're using them in other hours as well, then it can, yield some efficiencies.
Okay, well then, to finish where I started, once again, this final report needs to reassure people that their lives are not going to be unduly negatively impacted between now and 2031 if we go down this road. It's very important that the final report provide that reassurance, or we legislators are going to get a lot of complaints from our constituents.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Senator West. Excellent points. We're at time, but we have time for one more comment. I think from Delegate Morgan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's time this afternoon. I'm Todd Morgan, 29C, which represents Calvert and St. Mary's. I'll go quick. I believe in your recommendations, you included something regarding a cap and trade policy, but banning propane and gas appliances. I would bring your attention to, we have a large Amish and Mennonite community down here that, because of religious reasons, prohibits electrical use. So that would be a major impact on them, I believe, at the end of the day, if that was going to take place. So I would appreciate that being noted in your reports. I want to thank Senator West for bringing up that cost-benefit analysis idea. And I guess my question is the cost-benefit analysis been done for sole electric policy or considerations for other reliable sources?
So I'm not sure I understood the question. So let me try and you let me know if I'm not answering the right question.
Okay.
So the plan as a whole included economic impact analysis that also accounted for other benefits and found that the economic impacts were themselves positive, and then there were additional environmental benefits beyond that. So that's as the plan as a whole. As we discussed earlier, a requirement of the final plan is that we start looking at individual policies in more detail, and that's to come later.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for recognizing Calvert Cliffs. It does provide a third of the electricity or a little bit more for Maryland. And I do know, since it's adjacent to my district, they do plan to look for relicensing and working closely with us going into the future. And that was it for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so we are at time, and we got to all the hands. Good timing, everyone. Legislators are, well trained at keeping the time and making time for everyone else. So appreciate that you brought that training into this meeting. Thank you all for your questions and comments. We've taken down everything we heard in the meeting. We are open to written comment as well. If you'd like to provide us written comments, we appreciate that, as well as attendance at our 2 remaining in-person sessions. Again, they're in Baltimore at Morgan State next week, the 12th from 6 to 7:30. And then the one in Prince Frederick is the 19th. So a week after that, again, from 6 to 7:30. And that's at the College of Southern Maryland campus there. More details and registration are at mde.maryland.gov/climate change. So thanks again, everyone, for your participation today. And in the future, as we build our plan to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals, respond to climate change, enjoy substantial public health and economic benefits that come with the clean economy transition. Thank you all so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all so much. See you guys soon.